Thanks for joining me today, Matt.
Thanks for having me.
So just as a very brief way of introducing ourselves, um, how come you started becoming interested in antitrust law?
So, I started getting interested in it during the financial crisis of 2008 because too big to fail banks, too big to fail, and they caused huge damage. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Are there other institutions that are very big and powerful? And turns out there are. There's this whole area of law that is supposed to deal with that.
So if we look at the big tech companies, Nvidia, Apple, Microsoft, Google, do you think that these companies are qualitatively different from other kinds of monopolies that have been in the past?
I do. I think they are, they're global is kind of one important part of it. These are companies that, especially Google, maybe Meta, they are certainly Meta in Microsoft. They Google has, I think, I don't know, 15 products with more than half a billion users, and a bunch of products with more than a billion users. Chrome itself has 4 billion users. I mean, the scale of the operation is just different. And the the profitability, the growth trajectory is bigger than anything that we've ever seen, at least in America. So I think that there's something unusual about this moment in these companies. Typically as you get bigger, you grow slower. These companies are not slowing down in terms of their growth. They're taking about 30% of profits in the US economy, which is really high. And that's not counting what they're taking abroad, but just in the US, that's really high.
Can you point to a single policy failure that has created these monopolies, or is it like many different factors?
Well, I think that there are a lot of different policy failures, but they all stem from a decision in the early 80s in the US. And then I think it just that kind of moved to Europe in the 90s. And that decision was to focus regulatory policy, anti-monopoly laws on efficiency, the efficiency of capital instead of prohibiting conflicts of interest and concentrations of power. The European context is different. The European context has some anti-monopoly provisions, but it's more about state regulation, just because states have always been bigger and more powerful in terms of the economy in European history. That monarchies and aristocracies. Just the state-led growth is a model that always existed there. And in the U.S., the state was really a platform to allow private people to come together and do things on their own. And so our framework for prohibiting concentrations of power was much more directly anti-monopoly laws and prohibitions on conflicts of interest, sort of as a thinner but strong state versus the European model. But they had somewhat similar intellectual origins, and that we really reversed course. We said, whatever, thousands of years of history and hard-earned wisdom that said that people shouldn't have conflicts of interest. Nah, let's get rid of that. Let's only focus on making sure that things are efficient according to economists. And the result is, economists tend to really like big things. They tend to think, okay, if it's a big institution, then that it's big because it's good at something. And so we want to encourage that. And, there were changes in a bunch of different laws. I think the one, you can look at here would be antitrust law. That would be a significant shift. So changing how we enforce antitrust law. But you can also see significant changes in patents, in copyrights, in, communications regulation, the intermediate liability, all sorts of things that telecommunications environment, all sorts of things that we changed.
There are many, second effects, like what's it called, second-hand impacts of these monopolies. Of course, it's harder for new competitors to enter the market. There's this that
Yeah.
Cory Doctorow coined.
Yeah.
We get worse products. Um, are there any specific harms or like risks that you're particularly concerned about when it comes to these giant monopolies that are just growing and growing and growing?
Well, I think the biggest problem that we see is fear, right? Where what's happening is every business person in the world is saying, look, if I don't show up on Google Maps, my business is going to collapse, right? So Google has the power to destroy any business they want to. And they don't really use that power very often explicitly. They almost do it accidentally often. They'll just change their algorithm and all of a sudden, your business no longer shows up to customers. And that fear, you have this in every industry where you have a dominant player. The amount of fear is very real. I just think that big tech firms have this ability to coerce that at a scale that's pretty remarkable.
So these are all communications companies, and they manipulate the flow of information, and that's very dangerous in a democracy. And so what you see, or actually in any nation, it doesn't have to be a democracy. So what you see is unlike, say, telecommunications companies, which they might charge too much, they might be obnoxious, they might have bad customer service, but they don't fundamentally interfere with the conversation you want to have with someone you're calling. But these companies do. They interfere through inserting advertising or through changing algorithms or through user interface designs that are more addictive. They want you to behave in certain ways that are more profitable for them. And I think that those incentives that they have are not compatible with self-government and democracy.
And now, there's a whole new layer regarding AI, of course. All the big social media companies are now creating the next generation of digital
Right.
technology, right?
Yeah.
Do you think people should be more concerned about AI as an antitrust issue?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, AI AI is a neat technology, right? Is a general purpose technology. There's a lot of people talking about it in different ways and shapes and form. But the truth is, we haven't really regulated effectively many of our industrial sectors in a useful way for a long time. This may be different in Europe, but it's certainly in the US. And so you can look at AI and say, oh my gosh, this presents so many new challenges, but it's not like we were doing a great job with social media, right? Maybe AI is worse, who knows? But the reason it's bad is because we never regulated those systems well in the first place, right? It's a little bit like, maybe the cigarettes that you've been smoking for a long time got worse, or maybe they didn't. You don't know. But the problem is you were smoking the cigarettes in the first place.
We agreed. If we look towards the future, like the near-term future, do you imagine anything changing, or are these monopolies here to stay at least for a while?
Well, I mean, look, nobody knows what's going to happen. I mean, I think these dominant firms represent, they are a huge problem in and of themselves, but they also represent societies that are not capable of governing themselves. Like if we allow companies like this to ply us with addictive information streams, to manipulate our children, to put pornography and gambling everywhere, and we can't do anything about it, that says something about our democratic systems. And that's not sustainable. It's not that these institutions are going to do it to us. Maybe they will. They're making it worse. But the fact that we aren't responding to them with the severity that we need to says that our systems are weak. So it's not going to last forever. We might find within ourselves a kind of a new hunger to govern and find our liberty again, or we might not. And if we don't, I think we'll probably end up in some sort of social collapse. So it's not going to stay this way forever. Certainly never does. But it's definitely a warning that we should heed. because there's a lot of nice stuff in our societies, and we should want to preserve what we can.
So what can people do, like individuals? I know for perspective, there's been some campaigns. Scott Galloway is one of the influencers who started this campaign that you shouldn't buy big tech products at all. Is that the right approach, or what can people do?
Sure. I mean, that look, ultimately that these companies need to be, we need to break them up or re-regulate them or both using our political systems, right? Because these are political problems, and you can't fix them with consumer behavior, consumer boycotts. But a consumer behavior, a consumer boycott that leads to a political outcome works. I would just say pushing your political leaders to break up these concentrations of power is important. Um, yeah, and I don't know. I don't know how to deal with the EU. The EU seems really bureaucratic and annoying. So,
Yeah, there's a lot of regulation that's the EU's approach, right?
but no,
Um,
but not really, not real regulation. Because the thing is about these big tech companies is while there's a lot of like busy work they have to do in Europe, nothing actually affects them. So it's, I know Margaret Vestager was the EU DG comp person. I don't know who the new one is. It doesn't matter. She never really affected these companies' businesses. And she got all sorts of press for doing all this stuff, but it was fundamentally ineffective. And it was obviously ineffective at the time, but it did, get their lawyers to get paid a bunch of money to like keep filing forms. So it's not that there's a lot of regulations. It's because I don't mind a lot of regulations as long as those regulations do something. The problem is these regulations that I saw in Europe didn't do anything or they didn't address the concentrated power. Maybe I'm wrong.
hmm.
Look, I'm not in Europe and maybe there's like it's way easier to deal with things there than I assume. But that was my impression. Um, and I think that might be changing a little bit. But you see, you know, look, I mean, this is linked to a whole series of other problems, right? For example, like Europeans love focusing on how bad Trump is because he's bad, and he's obnoxious, and he likes to be mean to Europe because Europe is not united and weak and whatever. But the truth is that the country that is destroying European industrial capacity is China. And that Germany's losing what, like 10,000 jobs a month or something to Chinese um, unfair competition. And the Europeans aren't doing anything about it. And they're just sort of like, we believe in free trade and we don't believe in state power to arrange markets. And we're standing for these values, but also we need to do something about this Chinese. It's like it's incoherent. And that's the same thing about these big tech companies. So a lot of Europeans look at these big tech companies and say, that's bad America, right? Which it's not. This is not about America. Sure, these companies are American, but it's the Europeans are. Spotify is not. Spotify is a problematic company. It's smaller, but it's problematic. It, Europeans need to start looking at these companies not as American companies, but as just companies that they can address and break up and restructure. And my experience with dealing with European enforcers is they are both bitter towards America, but also overawed by America. So they think, oh, we can't really do anything to Google because that's an American company. But at the same time, they're deeply resentful of Google because it's an American company. But that's not the issue. The issue is Google is a monopoly in many different ways and is dangerous. And it needs to be regulated and broken up like a monopoly. And Europe is big and powerful and should be able to do that.
Do you really think? Do you really think that, though? Do you think that the EU could break up a company like Google from
Of
outside of
course.
the EU? How would that work exactly?
How would the EU break up Google?
Yeah,
I mean, say you're not allowed to own a dominant search engine and a dominant mapping company. And if you do, we're going to put you in jail and then start jailing Google executives who live in Europe until they break up, you know.
yeah. I suppose that's the hardline approach, but that would also mean that we lose access to Google potentially, right? Or at least there could be big consequences.
Well, Google will not like it, but is Google going to give up a quarter of their revenue? I don't think so.
Yeah. they'll have to adapt somehow.
Yeah.
They can't lose out on the market, and that's why the EU is not really leveraging its bargaining power that well. It's exactly as you say. The EU is afraid, on one hand, to really act on these complaints we have and tell the big tech companies either you comply or you have to get out of our countries. The EU doesn't want to say that, but we feel like comfortable complaining about all the negative impacts these companies are having, but we don't really know what to do about it.
No, I
So
don't
yeah,
think that's it.
it's a big pickle.
I think it's that the I think that the Europeans, it's like everyone in the Western world, they don't want to make any decisions. Like it's not like the US is any better, but we don't have the excuse of saying the US is the problem because we are the US. So we have to actually just, we're just openly corrupt. But look, if you people don't want to do work. Europeans are no different. They don't want to make any decisions. And they're like, oh, well, there's nothing we can do about it. And it's just like, okay. I mean, if you can't, like, this is, it's just stupid. I don't know what to
Uh,
say. Like, if you just don't want to do it, you don't want to do anything. I mean, the same thing is, I mean, I brought up China because China, there are very obvious things that the Europeans could do to address Chinese coercion, and they just don't want to. They just don't want to. I mean, and like, okay, you don't want to, you don't want to, but don't act like this is so hard. You just don't want to pay
mm,
the price to actually be free. All right.
yeah. It would be much easier in many regards to take the hardline approach. For instance, regarding Meta, it's like an endless cycle. We find them, nothing happens. They pretend to comply. It starts over and over and over again. It would be much
But I could have told
easier.
you at the beginning, none of those fines matter. Everybody
Yeah,
knows they don't matter. And all of the laws that the Europeans, a lot of the, not all of them, but a bunch of the laws the Europeans wrote were never designed to do anything. They're very vague. Um, the regulatory, they give regulatory authority to Ireland. Like, what the fuck? You're giving it to
yeah.
Ireland? You know what you're doing. These are not intended to do anything. This is busy work. And so, my view is don't either just accept it and just say, look, we're too afraid and Google is going to run our economy, or do something about it. But this whole we're going to do busy work to pretend like we're doing something so that we can make the bureaucrats in Brussels feel good. Okay. So I don't know. Trump doesn't make it easier. That's definitely true. Like Canada is in a lot of trouble because Canada is totally dependent on the US. They have no leverage, or they have very little leverage. But that's not true with Europe. I remember when Biden did the Inflation Reduction Act and to try to encourage more production of solar panels and batteries and things like that in the US. And the Europeans did nothing but whine about it. Oh, this is protectionist. Oh, this is the worst. And then, I I have no like Europeans love to pretend that the big bad Americans want to burn all the oil, but then you have a clear example of a American leader that didn't want to do that, and the Europeans were hostile because it modestly threatens their deeply, deeply protectionist approach to political economy.
Yeah.
And Janet Yellen was very explicit. She just said, "Look, Europe should do this too." And you saw this over and over. I mean, during COVID, the US actually said, we want to share our pharmaceutical technology with the rest of the world. And it was the Germans who said, no, these our vaccines are too critical. We are not going to share it with the rest of the world. And they blocked it along. I think it was the Swiss as
Really?
well.
Okay.
Yeah, the trips, and look, America does a lot of bad things. Don't get me wrong, but you can't control us. You can control yourselves.
Mm.
And I think that you know there's a lot. You guys don't get a handle on what you're doing, on what's happening and this is more a kind of a criticism of Germany. It's not going to work out well.
I agree with you, with with most of your points there. Just to I wouldn't say challenge it, but just to bring up the counterpoint. um, particularly regarding the digital economy. The EU would be completely helpless without Microsoft and Google and Amazon, also particularly. Uh, and now with AI, we are so far behind capability-wise. We can never really catch up, at least not for the foreseeable future. So we have put ourselves in like a really difficult situation because we want to be free, and we've always thought of the US as a complete equal value partner, like sharing our values 100%. And it's just very recently, like second time Trump was elected, that we realized that we have different values after all, perhaps. And that came as a shock for for many Europeans, apparently. So we weren't really prepared for it. And now in this situation where we're completely dependent on the US tech, and we are not really sure. I don't think we lack the courage to just. In theory, we could say that the EU Commission sent a letter to Meta and said that either you comply 100% with all these laws, with GDPR, the AI Act, and so forth, or we'll just ban your service in the EU. Perhaps that would be the smarter approach. What do you think?
I don't know. I kind of gave up on Europe 5 years ago. I don't think you have any different values than the US. I think that's just like is self-indulgent garbage. You guys are going to have populists elected all over Europe because fundamentally you're a weak set of democracies that aren't serving the needs of your people. And JD Vance is an asshole, and he said a bunch of things that were not true about the right or about Europeans. But you're no different than America in this regard. You're just not serving the interests of your people. Not you, obviously, but I'm not blaming you for it. But I'm saying like Germany's losing, is getting deindustrialized right now. That's what the US went through. That's why we turned to Trump. You don't want Germany to go right wing. It doesn't work out well, but they're just choosing it. I mean, I when I deal with European elites, they sound like the worst Democratic Party hacks that I know. So the
Okay.
same thing's going to happen in Europe that's going to happen here. And this whole pretense, oh my gosh, it turns out we have different values. It's the same lazy bullshit that I saw on the left in America. You're just a few years behind us. So
Yeah. Okay.
um, I don't know what the AI Act, none of these laws, I don't know what these laws do. I think these laws are kind of like, okay, I mean, there's some elements to it that make some sense, but I, you know, I don't I don't have like a tech strategy for Europe. I'm not sure what to do about, how to get the Europeans kind of to be competitive in AI. I don't even know that that particularly matters. But um, I think there's lots of things that a huge market or set of markets could do to, you know, to run their societies better and not be as dependent on a Microsoft or an Amazon or whatever. I mean, the US is highly dependent on European industry, is highly dependent on Chinese industry. We don't have this, for some reason, we don't have the same attitude that the Europeans have, which is like we're totally helpless. And I don't know. I mean, it doesn't feel like every strategic situation I've ever been in, no matter how bad, there are always choices you can make to try to improve things. And it just sort of feels to me like the Europeans have this fantastically wealthy continent, a very bad political system that it just doesn't allow for very much, and a lot of capacity. And everyone is just kind of like, well, there's nothing we can do about anything. And that's the basic problem. If you don't think there's
Hmm.
anything you can do about anything except keep things the way they are, you'll just keep going the direction you're going.
Yes, there's way too much bureaucracy in the EU. It's a major problem. And you're right about, the more radical parties. They could easily gain more influence in many of the big European countries. What about the big tech companies? Do you think that that could, in the future, like be made a Microsoft or Google in Europe that would grow as big as these companies are in the US?
Well, first of all, I think the bigness of these companies is bad. So I think that it is It is not a good thing. Europeans should not want their own Microsoft. They should want to have 1,000 different companies that can do the things that Microsoft does. I mean, that is one of the good things about Europe is that there's basically like there's ASML, which is the big tech powerhouse, but and then you got a lot of big companies, but those big companies are largely the problem in Europe. Germany is like held hostage by its legacy automakers. It's a problem, right? I would say what you want to do is use these technological inflection points like AI, try to figure out how to move off of the platforms on which you're dependent. And I see some, there's attempts to build out data centers, buying NVIDIA chips and doing that. I mean, that's useful. I would just try to find ways, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? Figure out, is there a piece of Microsoft you can take off? Microsoft has a bunch of cybersecurity stuff. Can you do some cybersecurity? There's a lot of that in Europe and Israel and various other places. You might be able to pull that, line of business. Where are the lines of business you can make more competitive? I know Microsoft has, its Office suite. Google has their, Google has its kind of productivity suites. I don't think that that's too hard to build. You could do versions of that. I think there are open source versions of that. I think, China has shown that if you want to organize yourself to move away from a certain tech stack, you can do it over time. And I think if the Europeans want to, they could. And I think they should. I think that would be a good thing. It would be a good thing for us. It would be bad for our big companies, which, our big companies are bad for us. So I would appreciate that. And I think it would be good if Europe would provide some competition to our big tech firms. I don't like it. I don't like the situation where these guys have dominance everywhere. I'll give you, I mean, Russia had Yandex as a search engine, and Google was in Russia. And so there were these two companies that were competing for the Russian search engine market. And because Yandex existed, there was a case against Google for monopolization because it was gaining market share in Russia, just like it was in Europe. And the case in Europe brought by DG Comp and the case in Russia happened at roughly the same time. The case in Russia, the Russians said, okay, Google has been monopolizing, and they forced everyone who had an Android phone, they sent a text message saying, do you want to use Yandex or do you want to use Google? And they got rid of a lot of the defaults. And what happened is Yandex gained a bunch of market share. And the Europeans, they did a case against Google. And then they said, because of their stupid laws, they said, okay, we found that you're guilty, Google. Now we're going to ask you what your remedy should be. So then Google said, well, here's what we think our remedy should be. And then they accepted that. And of course, it didn't work. But part of the reason it didn't work is because there was no competitive search engine. I mean, there was Bing, which was from Microsoft, but there wasn't really nobody had really built a competitive search engine. So even if the remedy had been really good, maybe it wouldn't have worked. We don't know. But the point is the Russians, they're authoritarian and everything, but they also were just governing. And then they also had this tech capacity. I think that's the way to think about the situation in Europe is figure out a way to force these companies to expose certain data, like Google, for example. You could say to Google, look, you don't have to split off Google Maps, but all the business information in Google Maps, right? All the businesses, because every business will tell Google Maps the right address, their phone number, because they need to stay in business, right? So, and Google Maps is really important. So Google Maps, that's their competitive advantage. It's easy to build a mapping platform. It's hard to get all that information. So you could say to Google, that is public information, and you have to expose that and let anybody get access to that database. If you did that, you would see a bunch of companies that could build equivalent mapping capacity to Google Maps. I don't think Google would pull out of Europe if you force them to do that. And then all of a sudden you'd have rival mapping companies, and then you have leverage on Google around mapping because now you have your mapping companies. And if Google pulls their maps out, whatever, your companies will take share. Right. And I think that's kind of, so there's things that are hard to replicate. There's things that are easy to replicate. There's a bunch of stuff that's in between, but you have to have a clear strategy to force, to eventually provide some competition to the American tech stack. And then you probably don't even need to do anything once you have that competition. It's fine if American companies are competing. The problem is they're monopolies, right? That's our problem too. I
Matt,
guess one
cool.
thing I would think is after, look, after Trump, there's going to be a moment when the Americans are going to try to figure out, right, what do we do? Because nobody trusts us because we've been an agent of chaos and gangsters for a while. And I think there's going to be an opportunity for other countries to kind of say, all right, what do we want to work together on? What do we not want to work together on? Like, how do we build a relationship that's not based on trust, that's not based on, keeping the stock market up? Because frankly, a lot of the US European value system is bullshit anyway. Like, we know that. Like the Iraq, it's like Europeans are like, we don't like the Iraq war, and then they demand that the US take out Libya. And it's just all gross. Um, and so what is the arrangement we build after this mess, right? And I think that we do have a common interest in seeing no one have monopolies. We don't want any monopolies anywhere. We don't want China to have a rare earth magnet monopoly because they will use it against us. They'll use it against European companies. They'll use it against India. They use it against everyone. And we don't want America to have these tech monopolies. That's a problem too. And we don't want there's so I think that there is a way to say, look, let's cooperate and make sure that no one has too much power, that there are multiple sourcing for all of these different chemicals, information sources, and various inputs across the world. And I think that will make a safer world. And we don't have to trust each other to do that.
Okay, Matt. I want to thank you very much for your time and your insights here. It was great talking with you.
All right. Thanks so much. I hope that was useful.